In the year 1839, the most powerful empire on earth went to war to force an entire nation to keep buying a highly addictive substance it had tried to ban. That empire was not a criminal gang hiding in shadows. It wore a crown, flew a flag, and commanded the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. Welcome to True Earth History, where hidden history comes to life. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind the headlines. The story of Britain and opium is not a rumor or a theory. It is written in the official records of the British Parliament and the East India Company. To understand how it began, you have to go back to a simple but devastating problem that the British Empire faced in the early 18th century. Britain had developed a deep and national addiction to Chinese tea. Millions of cups were consumed every single day across the British Isles and its colonies. But China wanted nothing that Britain made. Chinese emperors called British goods inferior and told British merchants that China had no need for anything the West produced. This created a massive trade imbalance. Silver was flowing out of Britain and into China at a rate that made British treasury officials deeply and urgently alarmed. Britain was essentially paying for tea with one of its most precious resources, and China was simply collecting that silver and giving nothing of equivalent value in return. The British East India Company, one of the most powerful commercial organizations in human history, began searching for a product that China would actually want to buy. That product was opium. It was being grown in large quantities across the fertile fields of Bengal in India, which Britain now controlled almost entirely. Bengal had ideal soil and a warm climate for the poppy plant. The East India Company recognized this and began organizing large-scale opium cultivation across the region systematically. By the late 1700s, the company had established a government monopoly over opium production in Bengal. No farmer could grow or sell opium without company permission and oversight. The opium was then processed into a tradable form, packed into large balls, auctioned in Calcutta to private merchants, and then shipped east toward the coast of China. Because China had already made opium importation illegal, the company created a careful workaround. It would not technically ship opium to China itself. It would use private traders. These private traders, many of them British and American merchants, would buy the opium in Calcutta and then smuggle it directly into Chinese ports along the southern coast. The ships would anchor just outside Chinese waters. Small, fast boats called scrambling crabs and fast crabs would race out to collect the illegal cargo under cover of darkness. Chinese customs officials were often bribed. Local gangs helped distribute the drug inland. A vast and well-organized black market for British-produced opium spread rapidly through Chinese cities and towns. The scale of this operation grew at a breathtaking pace. In 1729, China reported around 200 chests of opium entering the country each year illegally. By 1838, that number had exploded to roughly 40,000 chests per year. Each chest contained around 60 kilograms of processed opium ready for use. China was drowning in the drug. Millions of Chinese citizens, from farmers and soldiers to government officials, had become dependent on opium in less than a century. The Chinese emperor at the time, the Daoguang emperor, looked at his country and saw a civilization being hollowed out from the inside by a foreign substance. He saw soldiers who could not hold their weapons steady. He saw tax collectors spending government funds on the drug. He saw families broken and villages emptied. In 1838, the emperor appointed a brilliant scholar and official named Lin Zexu to travel to Canton and stop the opium trade by any means necessary. Lin Zexu was not a violent man. He was a writer, a thinker, and a deeply principled administrator who believed that law and reason could solve the problem. He wrote a formal letter to Queen Victoria of Britain, appealing to her conscience and asking how her country could justify selling poison to the Chinese people for profit. The letter was compassionate, logical, and deeply moral. It asked whether Britain would tolerate another nation flooding its cities with an addictive substance that destroyed families and communities. There is no evidence the letter ever reached Queen Victoria directly. The British government did not respond to it. The opium trade continued without pause or interruption. Lin Zexu then took dramatic action. He descended on Canton, surrounded the foreign trading posts, cut off food and water supplies, and demanded the merchants surrender all opium stocks. After weeks of standoff, the British merchants handed over 20,000 chests of opium. Lin Zexu had every single chest mixed with salt and lime and dissolved into the sea. He knelt at the shore and offered a prayer to the spirit of the sea, asking forgiveness for poisoning the water with what he called a foreign evil. Back in London, this act of destruction was not seen as justice. It was seen as an attack on British property and British commercial interests in the region. British merchants calculated the destroyed opium at a value of around £2 million sterling at the time, which in today's terms would represent hundreds of millions of dollars. The British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston prepared for war. He framed the coming conflict not as a defense of drug trafficking, but as a matter of free trade. This framing was deliberate and strategic. Calling it a free trade dispute made the war sound principled and modern rather than what it actually was at its core. In June 1840, a fleet of British warships arrived off the coast of China. The vessels carried cannons, far more powerful than anything the Chinese military possessed at the time. The Chinese Navy still relied on wooden junks and traditional weaponry. They had no steam-powered vessels and no experience fighting the kind of industrial warfare the British had mastered. The first battle was devastating. British iron warships sailed directly into Chinese fire and emerged almost untouched. Chinese cannon fire bounced off the hulls or fell short completely. British rockets, cannons, and trained naval gunners destroyed Chinese defensive positions along the coast. Fort after fort fell in hours. Cities that had stood for centuries were taken in days. The Chinese government was shocked. The emperor had believed that China, with its ancient civilization and massive population, could not be defeated by a distant island kingdom across the world. He was wrong. The military gap between Britain and China at that moment in history was enormous. It was the gap between the industrial age and the pre-industrial world. As British forces moved further inland along Chinese rivers, towns surrendered quickly. Local populations watched in silence as soldiers carrying a foreign flag occupied their streets and government buildings. By 1842, the Chinese government had no choice but to negotiate. The war was over, and it had ended in complete and humiliating defeat for China. The resulting agreement was called the Treaty of Nanking. It was the first of what Chinese historians later called the unequal treaties, a term that carries pain to this day. Under this treaty, China was forced to pay Britain 6 million silver dollars as compensation for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed in Canton 2 years earlier. China also paid 12 million silver dollars to cover the costs of the war that Britain had launched against it. The nation was paying for its own defeat. The island of Hong Kong was handed over to Britain and would remain under British control for the next 155 years until 1997. 5 Chinese port cities, including Shanghai and Canton, were forced open to British trade, and British citizens living in China were given legal immunity from Chinese courts and laws. The opium trade was not formally legalized in the treaty, but it was also not stopped. It continued to grow because China no longer had the power to resist it. Within a decade, opium imports into China doubled again. The drug was now flowing into the country openly, almost without interference, carried on ships that flew the British flag. Some British politicians did speak out against this. In a famous parliamentary debate in 1840, a young member named William Gladstone called the war unjust and the trade disgraceful. Gladstone would later become Prime Minister of Britain 4 times. But in 1840, his voice was in the minority, and the war went ahead despite his passionate opposition. The majority of Parliament voted in favour of the war. They voted not knowing the full details, guided partly by the government framing of the conflict as a trade issue. The East India Company continued to grow its opium operations in Bengal. Production expanded. New areas were brought under cultivation. More farmers were organized into the opium supply chain. Indian farmers who grew opium were often locked into contracts with the company that left them very little room to grow food crops or pursue other forms of income. Many farmers grew poorer, even as the company grew richer. The opium economy benefited the company, the merchants, and the British Treasury far more than it benefited the growers. At its peak, opium revenue accounted for roughly 1/6 of British India total government income. This was not a side business. It was a central pillar of colonial finance. The money funded roads, railways, administrative buildings, and the salaries of the civil servants who ran the British colonial government across the vast subcontinent of India. In other words, the infrastructure of British India, much of which still stands today, was partly built on the profits generated by selling an addictive drug to China. This is not a theory constructed after the fact. British financial records from the colonial period make the connection between opium revenue and government spending completely and transparently clear. The Second Opium War began in 1856. A Chinese vessel, called the Arrow, was boarded by Chinese authorities, and Britain used this as a justification to launch another military campaign. France joined Britain in the Second War. Together they attacked Beijing itself, the imperial capital, and burned the Old Summer Palace, one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed. The Old Summer Palace had stood for over a century and contained irreplaceable artworks, manuscripts, and cultural treasures from across Chinese history. Its destruction was total and deliberate. The Second Treaty of Peking in 1860 forced China to legalize the opium trade completely. The drug that had been illegal for decades was now officially permitted by law. Britain had gone to war twice to ensure that a drug trade remained open. The Chinese government had been defeated twice trying to protect its own people from addiction. By the 1870s, an estimated 10 million Chinese citizens were regular opium users. Some historians place the number significantly higher when seasonal and occasional users are included in estimates. The social damage was immense. Families sold their possessions to fund opium use. Productive land fell out of use. Government functions slowed as officials themselves became dependent on the drug. Children in some regions grew up watching parents consume opium daily. It became normalized in certain communities the way alcohol becomes normalized in communities with high rates of dependency. The British government knew what the drug was doing. Reports from British consular officials stationed in China described the social devastation in vivid and detailed terms in official dispatches. Yet the trade continued because the financial stakes were extraordinary. The British Empire had built an economic system in which opium was not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be managed. In Britain itself, public awareness of the full scale of the trade was limited. Most British citizens drank their tea without knowing the economic chain that made it so affordable. The cheap tea on British tables was connected directly to the opium flooding Chinese streets. Silver from opium sales paid for tea exports. The two commodities were financially interlinked. Some British missionaries and reform campaigners did travel to China and report back on what they saw. Their accounts described a public health catastrophe of staggering proportions in the region. Organizations like the Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade were formed in Britain during the 1870s, pushing Parliament to end the trade on moral grounds and humanitarian grounds. These campaigners were not immediately successful. The financial interests involved were too large and too deeply embedded in colonial governance to be dismantled quickly by moral argument alone. But the pressure was growing. Questions were being asked in Parliament with increasing frequency. Journalists were writing about the trade. Church leaders were calling it a national sin publicly. The debate inside Britain about the opium trade became one of the defining moral arguments of the late Victorian era, sitting alongside debates about slavery and colonial exploitation more broadly. In 1893, the British government commissioned an official inquiry called the Royal Commission on Opium. Critics hoped it would recommend ending the trade, once and for all, definitively. Instead, the commission concluded that opium use in India was not especially harmful, and that ending the trade would cause serious economic disruption to the colonial government in India. Critics immediately challenged the findings. They argued that the commission had been structured to reach a conclusion that protected revenue rather than to honestly assess the humanitarian evidence before it. The debate continued into the 20th century. International pressure was mounting. Other nations, particularly the United States, were pushing for global agreements to restrict the narcotics trade worldwide. In 1906, a new Liberal government came to power in Britain. It was more sympathetic to the reform campaign and began moving toward a negotiated end of the opium system. An agreement was reached with China in 1907. Britain committed to reducing Indian opium exports to China by 10% each year, with the goal of ending the trade completely. By 1917, the trade had effectively ended. After more than a century of operation, the system that had reshaped two nations and caused immeasurable suffering was finally brought to a close. But the legacy did not end with the trade. China was left with millions of citizens dependent on opium, a weakened government, and a deep national wound that lasted generations. The period of the Opium Wars became central to how China understood its modern history. Chinese leaders and historians called it the century of humiliation, and the phrase still carries enormous weight. That century shaped Chinese foreign policy, national identity, and the country relationship with Western nations in ways that are still visible and relevant in global politics today. India too carried consequences. The opium economy had structured colonial agriculture in ways that left many farming communities without diversified crops or economic resilience when the trade finally ended. The East India Company itself was dissolved in 1858, partly as a result of the Indian Uprising of 1857. The British Crown took direct control of India and its finances, but the opium infrastructure the company had built remained in place for decades. The fields, the factories, the trade routes, and the administrative systems continued operating under government management. What the British Empire had built was not simply a trade operation, it was a vertically integrated narcotic system, from cultivation in Bengal to distribution networks reaching deep inside China. Every element of the operation was organized, financed, and protected by state power. That is what separated it from ordinary criminal enterprises and made it something historically unprecedented in scale. No criminal organization in history has ever matched the scale, the duration, or the institutional support that the British opium system commanded at the height of its operation. The revenues it generated, the wars it justified, and the human cost it produced make it one of the most consequential and least discussed chapters of modern imperial history. Understanding this history does not require anger or blame directed at any living person. It requires honesty, because honest history is the only kind that teaches anything of lasting value. The records are there. The parliament debates are documented. The trade figures are preserved. The treaties are archived. This is not a story built on rumor or speculation. It is a story built on evidence, and the evidence tells us that the most powerful empire in history organized and protected a drug trade on a truly industrial scale. When the opium trade finally ended in 1917, the damage left behind in China was so deep that recovery would take not years but generations to even begin. Millions of Chinese citizens were still dependent on opium. The drug had been flowing freely into Chinese society for over a century, and it did not simply disappear overnight. Local Chinese opium production had actually increased during the final decades of the trade because Chinese farmers had started growing their own poppies to compete with the imported supply. This meant that even after British exports stopped, opium remained widely available inside China. The demand had been created by the trade, and that demand survived the trade ending. The Chinese government tried to address the crisis, but it was governing a country that had been financially drained, militarily defeated, and institutionally weakened over the course of a century. Tax revenues were depleted. Government authority in rural areas was fragile. Warlords controlled large parts of the country, and some of them financed their armies directly through opium profits. The warlord era of the early 20th century in China was deeply connected to the opium economy that the British system had helped create and normalize across the country. Regional military commanders grew powerful by taxing opium production and sale in their territories. Some actively encouraged farmers to grow poppies because it generated more reliable income than food crops. This cycle, where political instability fed opium production and opium production funded further instability, became one of the defining features of Chinese political life in the 1910s and 1920s. It was not the only cause of China's turbulent early 20th century, but historians who study the period consistently identify opium as one of its most corrosive underlying economic forces. Meanwhile, in India, the end of the formal opium export trade left a significant gap in colonial government revenue. British administrators had to find new sources of income to replace it. New taxes were introduced, agricultural policies shifted. Some regions that had been devoted entirely to opium cultivation struggled to transition back to growing food crops for local consumption and trade. The communities most affected were the farming families in Bengal and other opium-growing regions who had been locked into the company production system for 2 and 3 generations. These families had never been wealthy under the opium system. The profits had flowed upward to merchants, company officials, and the British Treasury. The farmers had received very little in return. When the trade ended, they were left without the one crop that the entire administrative system had been built around, and without meaningful support to transition to something sustainable and viable. This story of agricultural communities left behind by colonial economic systems is not unique to the opium trade. It repeated itself across the British Empire in different forms and places. But the opium case was particularly stark because the crop itself had no value for local consumption. It had been grown entirely for export, entirely to serve a foreign commercial system. Back in Britain, the public reckoning with the opium trade was slow and incomplete. There was no formal national acknowledgement, no official inquiry into the human cost, no apology issued. The trade was simply allowed to wind down, and the broader conversation about what had been done largely faded from public discourse as new political crises demanded national attention. The First World War began in 1914 and consumed the attention of the British public entirely. Questions about Victorian-era opium policy became distant background noise in a world at war. This pattern of moral questions about empire being displaced by immediate crises meant that the full historical reckoning with the opium trade was deferred for decades, and in some ways indefinitely. Internationally, however, the conversation about narcotics was accelerating. The Hague Convention of 1912 had been one of the first international agreements to call for restrictions on the global opium trade. The United States had been a strong advocate for international narcotics control. American officials had watched the effects of opium in territories like the Philippines and were deeply alarmed. The League of Nations, formed after the First World War, took on narcotics control as one of its responsibilities and began building the framework for what would eventually become modern drug treaties. Britain participated in these international conversations, even as it was still winding down its own opium operations in Asia. The shift in British public position was real, but it was gradual. There is a deep historical irony in the fact that Britain became a signatory to international anti-narcotics agreements, while the infrastructure of its opium trade was still partially operational in India. The transition from opium empire to international drug control advocate happened slowly, over decades, driven more by changing financial realities and international pressure than by sudden moral transformation. In China, the political upheaval of the 20th century continued. The Chinese nationalist government that came to power in the late 1920s launched serious anti-opium campaigns across the territories it controlled. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, publicly committed to ending opium use in China within 3 years. The campaigns involved destruction of poppy fields and rehabilitation programs for dependent users. The results were mixed. In some urban areas, consumption did decline measurably. In rural areas controlled by warlords or outside nationalist authority, the drug remained as available as before. Then came the Japanese invasion of China in the 1930s, which brought devastation of a completely different kind. Japanese forces actually encouraged opium use in some occupied territories as a control mechanism. Historical records document that Japanese administrators in Manchuria and other occupied regions allowed and sometimes facilitated opium distribution among Chinese civilian populations to reduce resistance and generate revenue. China was experiencing, in a different form, another instance of a foreign power using narcotics as a tool of control. The echoes of the British opium system were unmistakable. When the Second World War ended and the Chinese Civil War concluded in 1949, the new government that emerged under Mao Zedong made eliminating opium one of its first stated priorities. The campaign was rapid and extremely strict. Poppy fields were destroyed, dealers faced severe punishment, users were sent to compulsory treatment centers. The state applied its full authority to the problem. By the early 1950s, opium use in China had been dramatically reduced. The country that had been defined by the drug for over a century had managed to largely suppress it. International observers who had doubted the campaign could succeed were surprised by how quickly the results appeared. The combination of political will and total state authority had achieved what persuasion alone could not. The human cost of those methods remains a subject of serious historical debate, but the outcome was clear. The opium era in China had effectively come to an end by the mid-20th century. For historians trying to understand the full weight of what the British opium system had done, the numbers tell a story that is almost impossible to fully absorb emotionally. Over the course of roughly 150 years, the British East India Company and then the British colonial government exported millions of chests of opium into Chinese society. Each chest contained enough processed opium to sustain a significant number of users for an extended period. Multiplied across the full scale of the trade, the quantities are staggering. The revenue generated for the British Empire from opium during this period ran into hundreds of millions of pounds sterling, which in modern terms represents an almost incalculable sum of money. This money built colonial infrastructure, funded military campaigns, paid administrative salaries, and flowed back to investors and shareholders in Britain who may never have seen a poppy field in their lives. The shareholders of the East India Company included prominent British families, members of parliament, aristocrats, and merchants. The opium profits circulated through the highest levels of British society and economy. This is important because it means the financial benefits of the opium trade were not confined to a small group of distant adventurers. They were embedded in the heart of British wealth. Some of the great British fortunes of the 19th century, the ones that built country houses and funded political careers and endowed universities, had connections to the India trade, including opium. Tracing these connections is difficult because financial flows were complex and layered, but historians who specialize in this period have documented the links with increasing precision and rigor over recent decades. The question of historical accountability is one that different societies continue to answer in different ways. China has kept the memory of the Opium Wars central to its national identity. In Chinese schools, the Opium Wars are taught as a foundational event in modern history. The humiliation, the resistance, and the eventual recovery are core themes in Chinese national education. In British schools, the same events have historically received far less attention. For many British students, the Opium Wars remain a gap in their understanding of their own country imperial history. This asymmetry in historical memory matters because it shapes how two of the world's most important nations understand their relationship with each other in the present day and into the future. When British and Chinese leaders sit across from each other in diplomatic meetings, they are operating with very different inherited narratives about what the relationship between their two countries actually means. That gap in historical understanding is not neutral. It has real effects on trust, on negotiation, on how grievances are expressed, and how offers of cooperation are received and interpreted. Some British historians and public figures have in recent years called for a more honest public accounting of the opium trade and its role in British imperial wealth and policy. These calls have not yet translated into formal official acknowledgement, but the conversation is more open than it was a generation ago, driven partly by broader debates about colonial history and memory. The opium story also has important connections to the global drug trade as it exists today. The infrastructure of narcotics production and distribution that exists in Asia has deep historical roots. The Golden Triangle, the region where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet, became one of the world's major opium-producing zones during the 20th century, particularly during and after the Second World War. Some historians argue that the normalization of large-scale opium cultivation in Asia, originally driven by the British colonial system, created conditions that made regions like the Golden Triangle what they became. The connection is not direct or simple. Many factors shape the modern drug trade. But the history of industrialized opium production in Asia began with the British colonial system in Bengal. Understanding that starting point helps explain why Asia became central to global opium and heroin production in the 20th century, and why efforts to reduce production have been so persistently difficult. The legal frameworks that govern international drug control today also trace their origins partly to the reaction against the British opium system. The Hague Convention was a direct response to it. The international consensus that narcotics should be controlled, rather than traded freely, was built in direct opposition to the model that Britain had operated for over a century across Asia. Britain ultimately helped build the legal architecture of international drug control, even though it had spent generations resisting exactly that kind of control when it applied to its own commercial interests. This transformation in British policy was not driven by sudden moral awakening alone. It was driven by the reality that the financial case for the opium trade had weakened significantly by the 20th century. Indian opium was facing increased competition from Persian and domestic Chinese production. The profit margins that had once made the trade essential to colonial finance had narrowed considerably over time. Ending the trade became easier to justify morally when it was also becoming less financially compelling. The two forces, moral pressure and economic calculation, worked together to bring the system down. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Moral arguments alone rarely end systems of exploitation. They become effective when the economic costs of maintaining the system begin to outweigh the benefits. The abolition of the slave trade followed a similar pattern. The economics shifted, the moral argument intensified, and together they created the conditions for a change that seemed impossible for generations. The lesson is not cynical. It is realistic. Change in large systems requires both moral clarity and economic disruption. When the two align, even the most entrenched systems can be dismantled. What makes the British opium story so significant is that it shows how a legitimate, publicly listed, government-backed commercial organization can operate in ways that would be considered criminal by modern standards. The East India Company had shareholders, directors, annual reports, and parliamentary oversight. It operated within the legal framework of its time. And within that framework, it ran an industrial drug trade. This forces us to think carefully about the relationship between legality and ethics, between what a law permits and what morality demands, between the interests of a state and the welfare of people. Those questions did not disappear when the opium trade ended. They resurface in every generation, in every context where powerful institutions pursue profit at the expense of vulnerable human populations. The families in Bengal who grew poppies under company contracts and the families in China whose lives were shaped by dependency were both populations that powerful systems treated as secondary concerns. Their stories are not well known. They do not appear in the official records as prominently as the merchant profits or the parliamentary debates, but they are the human core of this history. Recovering their stories requires reading between the lines of official documents, finding the accounts written by missionaries and reformers, listening to the histories preserved in communities that lived through the era. That recovery work is happening. Historians in China, India, Britain, and elsewhere are producing scholarship that fills in the human dimensions of a story that official records often reduce to trade statistics. As this scholarship grows, the full picture becomes clearer and more uncomfortable. It is a picture of immense institutional power used in ways that caused immense and lasting human suffering. It is also a picture of resistance. Lin Zexu, standing at the shore in Canton, dissolving 20,000 chests of opium, is one of the most powerful acts of moral defiance in history. He knew the consequences. He knew Britain would respond with force. He acted anyway because he believed that the law and the welfare of his people demanded nothing less than that action. The British soldiers and sailors who fought in the Opium Wars were often young men from working-class backgrounds who had little understanding of the political and commercial forces that had sent them east. They were not the architects of the system, they were instruments of it, as soldiers in imperial armies almost always are, carrying out orders shaped by decisions made far above their rank. The merchants who bought opium in Calcutta and sold it off the Chinese coast were operating in a legal market. Their individual moral culpability is genuinely complicated by the structures around them. The culpability becomes clearer as you move up the chain toward the company directors who designed the system, the treasury officials who relied on its revenues, and the parliament that authorized its wars. History does not require us to assign guilt to every individual in a complex system, but it does require us to be honest about what the system did and who it served. The British Empire at its height was the most powerful political entity on earth. That power allowed it to do things that smaller or less organized states could not have done. One of those things was building and operating a century-long drug trade across 2 continents, enforcing it with naval power, and integrating it into the financial architecture of modern global commerce. No drug cartel in history, no criminal network, no illegal operation has ever come close to the scale, the duration, or the institutional sophistication of what Britain operated in Asia. That is not said to provoke anger or to diminish other chapters of British history. It is said because the historical record demands that it be said clearly and without distortion. The world that exists today, with its international drug treaties, its global health organizations, its debates about addiction and policy, exists partly in response to what the British opium system created. Understanding the origin of that system helps us understand why the problems it created have been so persistent, why addiction is such a complex public health challenge, why historical grievances run so deep. It also helps us understand something important about power, about how powerful institutions justify their actions, about how moral language can be used to cover commercial interests of enormous scale. Lord Palmerston called it free trade. The East India Company called it commerce. The British Treasury called it revenue. The people who lived through it called it something very different altogether. They called it ruin. They called it suffering. They called it the destruction of families and communities and futures that could never be fully recovered or restored by any later agreement. History does not erase what happened, it records it, studies it, and asks us to carry it forward honestly so that the lessons do not have to be learned again through new suffering. The story of how the British Empire built and operated the world's largest drug trade is not a footnote. It is a central chapter in the history of the modern world. It shaped nations, redirected economies, caused wars, and left consequences that stretched across generations and are still being reckoned with in classrooms, diplomatic halls, and communities around the world today. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. The past holds powerful lessons, and I will help you discover them.